Hi, Cassidy. Thank you so much for doing this.
Of course.
Okay, so tell me about yourself.
My name's Cassidy Craig. I'm a sophomore studying bioengineering. I'm originally from Baltimore. I went to Roland Park Country School for high school, and currently I work at George Washington University Hospital in the emergency room.
Okay, great. So what is your role at GW Hospital?
I'm a technician, so essentially, I'm like a emergency medical technician. So normally people think of those like riding on an ambulance, but instead of riding on an ambulance, I work in the ER and I help the nurses and doctors there.
Okay, great. So that kind of answers the question. What training do you have, and how did you acquire that training?
I took a 2-month-long class last summer through GW's Medical Faculty Association. It was about like 2 blocks over from the hospital, and the class ran every day from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And through that class, I acquired like my EMT basic license, which like includes CPR and basic life skills. And through that training, I was able to get this job. So, like, in order to work as a tech in the emergency room, like, you have to have certain licenses and a certain amount of hours of, like, clinical service.
Okay. Do you still have to go to trainings frequently to like keep up your certifications, and what kind of trainings do you have to go through?
Yeah, I definitely go to trainings all the time. Every hospital kind of differs, like based on how many trainings they have you do, and even like your scope of practice differs from hospital to hospital. So at GW, the techs have a lot of freedom, and they are allowed to take training classes in order to acquire like higher level skills. So as like an EMT basic, I'm not certified to start IVs in the back of an ambulance, but when I'm working at GW, I went through IV training, so I'm allowed to do IVs there.
How many hours a week do you work?
Right now I work 12 hours a week. I normally work a 12-hour shift Friday nights.
Okay. And what kind of patients do you see? Do you see like a variety of everyone, or do you just see like certain sectors, or do you just see trauma patients, or?
So GW has a really versatile ER. We see all sorts of patients, like ranging from homeless people to really important politicians, and everything in between. We see young people, old people. It's really unique based on its location. It has a lot of ambulatory traffic, so the metro stop is literally 5 feet from the entrance to the hospital, so we get a lot of people that like can't afford an Uber that jump on the metro. So our waiting room is always super crowded compared to hospitals in the area. We're also the level 1 trauma center in DC, so we receive all the traumas. We have like a stroke clinic, we have a heart center, like all of the big medical emergencies that you might have. GW is definitely the place to come.
Okay. Do you see many people in the ER who come in for car accidents, or just car accidents in general if they were in the car, or like pedestrians too?
Yeah, I definitely see a lot of car accidents while I'm at work. Not even just like head-on collisions, like side swipes. We also get a lot of pedestrians that get hit because DC is such like a walking city, and the traffic is really heavy, and sometimes people that like aren't from the area often like don't understand how to walk in the streets, like as simple as that sounds, but sometimes that can be confusing if you're from like a more rural area. Being in an urban setting can get pretty wild. So we definitely see a lot of patients that are injured from car accidents and a lot of pedestrians that are hit by cars.
Mm-hmm. What are the injuries that these patients that come in from the car accidents suffer, and how do you treat them?
So they can have such a wide variety of injuries depending on the severity of the accident. I would say that normally when someone is brought in for a car accident, they're normally in like a cervical collar, just because if you're like have a head-on collision or you're involved in some sort of trauma, and while you're in the field, like they're not sure, they can't see inside you, so they're not sure if anything's broken, and like your neck is a really like sacred part of your body, so if you break that, it's never good. So the EMTs and the paramedics that bring in our patients normally try to keep the C-spine stabilized, so they do that by a cervical collar, and that's really important when they get to the ER, because in a trauma, like when a trauma is being run, there's all different kinds of people in there, like ranging from doctors, surgeons, nurses, techs like me, and everyone works together so well, and that's one thing that's super important to be aware of is the patient's neck. So when you do a trauma assessment, the doctors look at all parts of your body, obviously, and they roll you so that they can like examine your back and make sure that like you don't have any like cuts or bruises or like exposed bones. So when they roll, it always goes by the heads count, just to make sure that that stays stable. And then another issue with car accidents is internal bleeding, since that's often really tricky, obviously because you can't see it. So a lot of the times if you're hit like with blunt impact, you won't like cut yourself open and start bleeding everywhere, but it's more like internal, so like you could rupture your spleen, which would cause like a lot of internal bleeding in your stomach. And also a big thing in car accidents is femur fractures, which is sort of like an awkward bone to break. It's super large and they hold a lot of blood, and your pelvis can hold like up to 2 liters of blood, which is like 1/3 of your body's blood capacity. So if you're bleeding into your femur or your pelvis, that's a really severe injury and it needs to be solved very quickly. So that's also something to note. When a trauma comes in, there's always a portable x-ray and ultrasound machine so that they can get like an internal look into the patient to make sure that we can give them the best care.
Okay. And then do you see that a lot of the accidents that do come in and you have to treat them for all those things that you just listed, are a lot of them accidents from distracted driving, from drunk driving, texting and driving, in general? Do you see like distracted people just in general in your patients, and how does that translate into the whole distracted driving in general?
I would say that I would have to guess that a lot of the accidents that come in are a result of distracted driving, because I'm like not actually on the scene of the accident. I don't actually see if they were on their phone when they had their crash or collision. But what I do realize is that a lot of the traumas when they come in are very distracted by their phone. Like they could have sustained life-threatening injuries, but they're so like worried about what's going on in the world and not about their own health in like such a severe time, which is sometimes frustrating. And I know that like nurses have to tell them to put their phone away like 4 times, and eventually they just get taken from them, because if you're in a trauma, everything goes to security. Also, a lot of times if someone was suspected to be texting and driving or drunk driving or something of that nature, of distracted driving, oftentimes a police officer will accompany them into the emergency room. So if there are DC police officers in the halls of the hospital, that's kind of like a giveaway that the patient was involved in some sort of illicit activity, such as texting and driving or drunk driving. And since I work night shifts, I would say that I see that quite often. We get a lot of drunk patients. and a lot of them are accompanied by police officers due to distracted driving.
Would you say that a lot of these patients who were distracted driving, either texting or drinking, are they mostly young people, or are they old, or what trends do you see?
I think that it varies. There's definitely, like, we see all sorts of patients, so young and old people that are involved in distracted driving, but I would say that a lot of the patients are on the younger side, since, like, the way that our technology and society is moving with such a heavy emphasis on technology, they are more susceptible to be distracted than, like, say, my parents' generation. And it's really sad to see, because it's never worth looking at your phone for like 15 seconds and causing a major accident. I know that one day when I was at work, we had like a 6-car accident on one of the highways outside of DC that was brought in. And one of the patients that came in was like trying to, like, I'm not sure, I think he was really scared, but he was worried that like the doctors and the nurses and all of the medical professionals were gonna like report to the police that he was on his phone when he was driving, and he like was really apologetic about it, and he wanted to know how all the other people that were involved in the accident were doing. So I think that people do realize the severity of it, but in the moment you never think that like anything bad is gonna happen to you. So experiences like that are really humbling, not only to the patients but to myself and the people that I work with. I know that I think about distracted driving a lot more seriously after seeing and witnessing firsthand how terrible and catastrophic the accidents can be.
Right. Have you ever, can you think of any more stories where patients have like died in these cases that you've been on, like not at the scene, but helping them in the emergency room?
Yeah, I would say that the most frequent like car accident deaths that I see are pedestrians being hit. And that's just because like based on physics, like if you're getting hit by a car, it's not looking good in your favor. So I think it's like not only an issue for the drivers, but also for like the people in the surrounding area. So like if you're crossing the street, like you also need to be aware of your surroundings and not on your phone or not talking to your friends or tying your shoe in the middle of the street, which like no one thinks, oh, let me just bend down in the middle of the road and tie my shoe. But if it's dark and you're jaywalking across the street, you never know. You could also be drunk and not thinking about the consequence of bending down in the middle of the road, or even if you drop your phone or something. So I think that like a lot of these accidents are two-way streets, not only distracted driving, but also distracted pedestrians and people not following the laws, like crossing the street when they don't have the crosswalk, or I don't know, riding their bike in the middle of the road or something like that. Also those bird scooters, we get a lot of people that come in on those. I don't know if you've ever ridden one.
I haven't.
But if you're trying to ride the scooter with one hand, it's very difficult. And actually, I had this girl come in that like needed stitches on her forehead because she fell off the bird scooter when she was like trying to respond to a text message. Because like if you think about it, like, oh, like you can probably scooter with one hand if it's like not electric, but when you add the electric aspect to it and you're trying to like drive with one hand, I don't know, she lost her balance, but it's like really frequent like occurrence. I remember she like felt really stupid because she was like, I don't know how I fell off the scooter, like but one of the nurses like was reassuring her and telling her that it happens all the time and that she's seen 5 people come in like in the last week that have fallen off the scooters.
That's actually really interesting. I've never thought that the bird texting while riding a bird's scooter would cause a lot of injuries. That's really interesting. Is there anything, when you receive these patients in trauma, and they are like accompanied by police officers, is there anything that like either you or like maybe the doctors that are more higher up like tell them to like reassure that they're not gonna make these mistakes again, or like ways that they like persuade them?
The police officer or the patient? The patient.
To the patient, I guess.
I mean, I think that most of the patients that are accompanied by police officers are either in really critical condition, and like if they're in super critical condition, they probably are already remorseful for their mistake and know exactly what they did and how it was wrong. But also, oftentimes a lot of the people that are accompanied by police officers like kind of have this mindset that they're like above the law in some sense, and that they're like immoral and can't be stopped, but obviously that's not true if they find themselves in the emergency room. So I think that most of the doctors don't do a lot of the lecturing about that. And there's like such a fine line between like patient confidentiality of like things that like we're allowed to tell other people and even the police. But I think that I've definitely witnessed police officers talking to the patients or police officers talking to family members of the patients. And sometimes it is interesting, and I like remember one time I felt like kind of a detective because I was helping one of the police officers kind of like piece together a part of the story. Like they found, or they like responded to a guy that was found down in the middle of the road. He had gotten hit by a car, but they couldn't like find any ID on him. It wasn't in his wallet, but part of the trauma assessment when you come in is the patients are stripped down, so like their entire body is exposed so that the doctors can like provide the best care that they can. So when I was taking the clothes out from underneath the patient and putting them in a patient belonging bag, I found his ID in his back pocket, and the guy was from Australia. So I think that that also like was a really memorable moment for me, because I just remember thinking, what if my parents got a phone call when I was studying abroad that I was in really critical condition because I got hit by a car in a foreign country? Mm-hmm. And I think that in like moments like that, working in the ER kind of helps me make better life decisions in the future. So whether that's I look twice before I cross the street, or I don't change the music on my phone until I get to a stoplight, I think that there's a lot of valuable lessons to be learned there.
Okay, so in the workplace, do you see any other instances of distracted driving just in general?
I think that one of a big part of distracted driving that I see, not necessarily that I'm involved in, but that I witness, is the traffic like from ambulances. And when ambulances come into the hospital, obviously like they're trying to drive fast and get their patient to the best care possible. So I feel like driving an ambulance is one of the most dangerous jobs in healthcare, because you're working the lights and weaving in and out of traffic, especially in such a busy city such as DC. It's super tricky to maneuver. There's also a bunch of one-way streets and pedestrians, as I've mentioned like 100 times, but not only are you trying to maneuver this like large van through narrow streets and heavy city traffic, but you're also making sure that your partner in the back is okay and your patient is still alive, and that we're providing them the best care. Also, I don't know if you've ever been in an ambulance, but it's super bumpy and it's not a very smooth ride. So while doing all of that, you're trying to drive as smooth and carefully as possible as not to hurt your patient more. So like if someone had like a spinal injury and they were laying in the back of my ambulance, but I was just like hitting like speed bumps and like holes in the road, like that's gonna injure them more. So there's a lot that goes into that I think it's really underrated, and not many people really think about that, but there's a huge risk driving an ambulance, and I think that
Do you think that like distracted drivers like are putting people in ambulances like at risk?
I think that definitely, like, say, like, if you, like, are on, like, a business call or something, or you have headphones in the car, and you don't hear, like, an emergency vehicle behind you, and you're just sitting in the middle of traffic, that makes it so much harder for the person that's driving, and they already have so much going on that's really not, like, an extra thing that they need to deal with at that moment. So I think that is definitely one of the most dangerous parts of transport in medical fields.
Okay, and my final question is, what's next for you, and like where do you think you're gonna go in the medical world?
Honestly, I'm not really sure. So as I said at the beginning, my major is bioengineering, so I knew that I wanted to do something in the medical field, but whether that means med school or nursing school or PA school, I haven't really figured that out yet, but working in the emergency room is definitely the place to go if you are struggling with that. If anyone is thinking of a career in medicine, I would highly recommend getting a job in the ER. Like, even as a scribe, you don't need any sort of intensive training like I did to be a scribe. You just need to learn how to write. So, I don't know. I think that maybe in the future I'll go to med school, but we'll see. I know I'll do something in medicine if not.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming.
Of course. Thanks for having me.